They sang for salvation. They lifted choirs with thunderous praise. Their voices filled cathedrals and shook the rafters of revival tents. But when the crowd stopped clapping and the lights went dark, many of gospel's greatest were left with nothing. No royalties, no homes, no family by their side. Gospel music promised hope and heaven, but for some of its most iconic voices, reality was far more cruel. How did the very people who defined a sacred genre end up penniless, forgotten, and alone? Let's find out. Chapter 1. Clara Ward, the star who was never paid. She was the face of gospel glamour. Clara Ward brought Hollywood elegance to Sunday morning sound. With the famous Ward singers, she dazzled audiences from Harlem to Hamburg, performing in mink stoles, sequined gowns, and silk gloves. But behind the rhinestones and radiance was a woman who was never truly in control of her career or her money. Clara didn't just sing gospel, she transformed it into a spectacle. She toured the world, shared stages with Mahalia Jackson, and even appeared on television in an era when few black gospel artists were given that spotlight. But her success masked a grim truth. Clara never owned the rights to her music. Most of her income flowed to others, managers, promoters, and even her own mother, Gertrude Ward, who managed the group with a tight grip and tighter books. By the 1970s, Clara's health was failing. Years of touring, financial stress, and mistreatment left her body broken. She suffered multiple strokes and eventually could no longer perform. She died in 1973 at just 48 years old. Despite decades of fame, she left behind no estate, no savings, and no peace. There was no grand funeral, just a whisper of a legacy muffled by contracts and control. Chapter 2. Reverend James Cleveland, the Gospel King with a Lonely Crown. He was called the King of Gospel, a musical visionary, the architect behind the modern gospel choir. Reverend James Cleveland shaped the very sound of contemporary worship, bold, soulful, and orchestrated with holy fire. But his final years were shadowed by controversy, isolation, and whispered secrets. Cleveland's rise was meteoric. He wrote hundreds of songs, founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, and mentored a generation of singers. But his success came with complications. Legal disputes over royalties, internal power struggles within the gospel world, and persistent rumors about his personal life left him increasingly isolated from the church community that once revered him. By the late 80s, his health declined rapidly. Cleveland, a diabetic, battled numerous illnesses, and his final years were marked by scandal. Accusations swirled, some public, some never proven. When he died in 1991, his estate was in disarray. Court documents revealed infighting over property and intellectual rights. There was no golden retirement, no lifetime tribute. He died alone in his home. The choir had gone silent. The king was without a kingdom. Chapter 3. Mahalia Jackson, a voice for God. She was more than a gospel singer. Mahalia Jackson was a movement. Her voice, full of anguish, strength, and unwavering faith, echoed through civil rights marches and presidential inaugurations. She was Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite singer, and the woman who moved nations with a single note. But the world that embraced her stage presence often rejected her humanity. Despite international fame and record-breaking sales, Mahalia struggled to hold on to the wealth she had earned. She refused to commercialize her message, turning down lucrative offers to go secular. That integrity came at a cost. She fought off exploitative contracts, dealt with racial discrimination in the industry, and endured tax battles that drained her finances. By the late 1960s, Mahalia was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Multiple hospitalizations, a painful divorce, and ongoing financial woes left her increasingly isolated. She died in 1972 from heart failure at just 60 years old. Despite being one of the most recognized gospel voices in the world, she spent her final days largely alone, burdened by debts. With her fortune gone and her light dimmed, she sang for freedom. But in death, Mahalia Jackson was bound by the same chains she spent her life trying to break. Chapter 4. Willie Banks, from choir leader to forgotten name. He had a gift for turning sorrow into sound. Willie Banks, the Mississippi native with a gritty, tear-soaked tenor, founded the Messengers and quickly became one of gospel's most emotive voices. His songs, like God Is Still in Charge, weren't just melodies, they were testimonies. But behind the power of his voice was a man drowning in instability. Banks spent decades on the road, often performing in tiny churches and community centers, far from the million-dollar stages others in gospel graced. He self-financed albums, paid his band members out of pocket, and rarely reaped profits from his work. Despite the popularity of his recordings, Banks saw little return. He trusted verbal agreements over contracts and was often taken advantage of by promoters and distributors who paid late or not at all. By the time illness took hold, Banks was broke. Diabetes led to amputations. He was no longer able to tour, and without income or medical insurance, he faded from the public eye. When he died in 1993, few in the mainstream gospel world even acknowledged it. No massive tribute, no Lifetime Achievement Award. His voice is still sampled today, used in choirs and worship services across the South. But the man himself, he was buried without a choir. Chapter 5. Enz Andrews, the high note that ended in silence. She could hit notes that cracked stained glass. Enz Andrews was known as the High Priestess of Gospel, her soaring soprano lifting the caravans and her solo work to legendary status. Her performance of Mary Don't You Weep is etched into gospel history, a cry from the soul of Black America. But the woman who gave so much to gospel music died with barely a whisper. Andrews toured relentlessly in the 1950s and 60s, packing auditoriums and revivals. Yet, like many women in gospel, she earned a fraction of what her male counterparts received. Royalties were scarce, managerial contracts were murky, and her name was often buried behind more marketable figures. As time passed and tastes shifted, Andrews was increasingly sidelined. Her later years were spent performing to smaller crowds. Medical bills mounted, and her once commanding presence became frail. She passed away in 2012. There was no televised memorial, no grand choir tribute. She had given gospel music its spine, but in the end, the industry turned its back on her. Chapter 6. Brother Joe May, the shouting tenor left behind. He was called the Thunderbolt of the Middle West. Brother Joe May's raw, electrifying vocals were unmatched, a firebrand of Pentecostal fervor who helped define quartet-style gospel. He was a star in the 1950s, often likened to a gospel version of Sam Cooke in intensity and reach. But the thunder didn't last. May never received the mainstream deals or recording royalties he deserved. Most of his success was regional, and while he packed churches and halls across the South and Midwest, the money rarely matched the acclaim. He was deeply religious, trusting in the Lord and in people, often to his own financial detriment. By the 1970s, his health declined. He battled diabetes and went blind. Unable to tour, he fell into poverty. He lived in obscurity, dependent on a shrinking network of family and church support. When he died in 1972, nearly penniless, his death barely made headlines in the gospel world he helped create. Today, his records are collector's items, but the man himself, gospel forgot him long before the grave did. Chapter 7. Albertina Walker, the Queen Without a Kingdom. She was the undisputed Queen of Gospel. Albertina Walker mentored generations, founded the Caravans, and turned voices like Shirley Caesar and James Cleveland into household names. Her influence was unmatched, her talent undeniable. But even queens can be left to fade without a crown or a throne. Walker's success spanned decades, but she never saw the financial security one might expect from her stature. She sang on hundreds of recordings, yet often lacked publishing rights. Her generosity was legendary. She gave to churches, choirs, family, but rarely saved for herself. As the industry changed, she struggled to adapt. Gospel was going commercial, and Albertina remained rooted in old-school tradition. In her later years, health problems compounded. Lung issues slowed her performances. She rarely made national appearances, and outside of gospel circles, her name began to vanish. When she passed in 2010, the gospel world mourned, but the broader industry was silent. She gave everything to gospel, yet gospel gave her no financial safety net. A queen, yes, but a queen without a castle. Chapter 8. Robert Anderson, the godfather who died in debt before Sam Cooke. Before James Cleveland, there was Robert Anderson. The Chicago native was one of the architects of modern gospel harmony. His smooth baritone, complex arrangements, and leadership of ensembles like the Roberta Martin Singers helped define the golden age of gospel. But like too many pioneers, his innovation was never rewarded with wealth or lasting recognition. Anderson was a perfectionist. He invested heavily in rehearsal time, studio sessions, and musical quality. But he wasn't a businessman. Record labels shortchanged him. Churches promised payments that never came. Contracts were either verbal or written in ways that robbed him of ownership. By the time the 1970s arrived, his health had deteriorated and the bookings slowed. He sank into obscurity, quietly teaching at small churches while dealing with mounting debts. He died in 1995, largely forgotten, without insurance, and without the honors typically reserved for a man of his influence. The sound of gospel may carry his DNA, but his name was written in disappearing ink. Chapter 9. Shirley Caesar's sister Anne, a life in the shadows. Everyone knows Shirley Caesar. Few know Anne. Anne Caesar was the quieter sibling, a deep contralto who harmonized behind her sister on early records and tours. She had a gift, raw, emotional, distinctly Southern, but she also had doubts, and doubts don't pay royalties. Anne left the spotlight early. Tired of being overshadowed, underpaid, and overlooked, she retreated to a modest life of ministry and occasional singing. She worked church admin jobs, cared for family, and lived simply. But her recordings, especially those early duets, remained fixtures in gospel history. The voice was unmistakable, even if the credit often wasn't. In her final years, Anne faced health problems without substantial means. Unlike her sister, she hadn't amassed wealth or accolades. She died in 2007, her passing noted by few outlets, her contributions largely forgotten. She didn't seek fame, but she never expected silence either. Chapter 10. Reverend Julius Cheeks, the voice that wrecked itself. His voice was a cannon. Reverend Julius Cheeks didn't just sing gospel, he unleashed it, a founding member of the Sensational Nightingales and later a solo powerhouse. Cheeks redefined what a gospel male lead could be: raw, thunderous, emotionally unhinged. But the very instrument that made him famous would become his undoing. Cheeks pushed his voice to the limit night after night, rejecting moderation in pursuit of the Holy Spirit. He was beloved for it, feared for it, even mimicked by secular artists. But the gospel industry never rewarded him with long-term security. He performed endlessly, often for small honorariums, with no label infrastructure to protect his legacy or health. By the 1980s, years of vocal strain, alcoholism, and unchecked health issues left him a shell of his former self. He had no real savings, no fallback career. His death in 1981 came quietly. There were no retrospectives, no posthumous compilations, just a funeral, a few newspaper mentions, and the lingering echo of a voice that burned too brightly for too long. Reverend Cheeks didn't die from silence. He died from shouting into a void that never shouted back. Chapter 11. Marian Williams, the innovator who faded to black. She could do things with her voice no one else could. Marian Williams wasn't just a gospel singer. She was an avant-garde force, an acrobat of emotion and range. From her work with the Ward singers to her solo career, she influenced Aretha Franklin, Little Richard, and a generation of boundary pushers. But innovation doesn't always translate into income. Williams was celebrated critically, but paid modestly. Her experimental style made her a darling among scholars and critics. But gospel audiences often wanted something more familiar. She spent much of her later life touring overseas, where she was revered, while being largely ignored in her home country. Despite a National Medal of Arts awarded just before her death, Williams died in 1994 with limited financial means and little fanfare. Her records were out of print. Her name, barely mentioned in mainstream retrospectives. She had transformed gospel, but in the end, the world she'd changed barely noticed her absence. Chapter 12. Thomas Whitfield, the genius who died quietly. He was gospel's secret architect. Thomas Whitfield, known as the Maestro, was a composer, arranger, and pianist whose innovations transformed the sound of gospel music in the 1980s. His fingerprints are on countless hits, but his name was rarely front and center. Whitfield worked with the best: Vanessa Bell Armstrong, Yolanda Adams, the Winans. His complex chord structures and jazz-infused arrangements elevated gospel to new heights. But being behind the curtain meant fewer royalties, fewer tours, and far less recognition. Despite his genius, he struggled financially throughout his life. In 1992, at just 38 years old, Whitfield died of a heart attack. His death sent a ripple through the gospel world, but no major tribute followed. No chart re-entries, just a quiet acknowledgement and a continued silence. He made everyone else sound better, but when he died, no one played his song. 12 voices, 12 lives of devotion, sacrifice, and unacknowledged genius. They built gospel's foundations, then were left outside the temple. In a genre that promises eternal reward, these artists were denied even basic recognition. Their stories aren't just tragic, they're warnings. Remember their names, share their stories. The chorus isn't complete without them.